Welcome, everyone. We're excited to introduce today's session, Background Screening During COVID-19, What Changed and What Stayed the Same. Today's session is brought to you by Sterling Backcheck. Sterling Backcheck is an identity background screening company in Canada, and will provide today's content. So, if you're not familiar with Sterling Backcheck, we are a leading provider of background screening and identity services in Canada. Through our Backcheck platform, which is available in Canada, we offer organizations services to help them create great and safe working environments, and partner with our customers to introduce to them to the background screening services for their organizations. I'm hoping that you can utilize the chat as we're kind of going through that. If you can hear us, if there's anything that you need. Okay, perfect. All right, so let me introduce today's presenters. We've got Iain Murray, who is our Regional Sales Director for Sterling Backcheck. Iain is based in our Vancouver area, and he's been with Sterling for 10 years or 15 years. Sorry, Iain, I don't have my notes in front of me, unfortunately. He's been working in different capacities within the organization, and is now spearheading some of our verticals. And then we've got Mark Sward, who is the Vice President and Global Head of Privacy. Mark is based in Montreal, but has a global purview within our organization. And Mark has been here for over 10 years as well. And Mark is based in our Montreal office. And I'm Marina Ilishev. I'm the Director of Marketing for Sterling Backcheck in Canada. All right, so with all the content that we provide, we always have to have a legal disclaimer that we are not a law firm. Anything that's provided here should not be construed as legal advice, and we're simply providing it for advisory purposes. So with that, here's a quick agenda. We have 3 main areas that we're going to cover. We'll talk a little bit about what changed during COVID-19 and some of the things that happened to the background screening industry. And then we'll talk about overview of current trends in Canada when it comes to background screening. And then Mark will talk a little bit about legal considerations that you should have when you're creating your own policies within your organizations. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Iain. And I think the poll actually has been added. So we could do that in a couple of minutes. So Iain, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the current situation with COVID, and then we'll do our poll. Iain? Did Iain freeze?
He might have. I'm sure he'll be back momentarily.
All right. Okay, well, while Iain is coming back, I can talk a little bit. And Mark, feel free to actually add any commentary as you, since you're familiar with this as well. So I wanted to touch a little bit about current landscape. So Sterling, along with other organizations, had a business continuity plan. Iain, are you back?
Yeah. What perfect timing for my internet to seemingly drop out.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you because I was going to cover your slides, but you'll do a much better job.
No problem, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I have no idea what happened there. Sorry, so yeah, across the country right now, the current landscape has changed a bit due to COVID-19. Many local police services have remained closed or have limited hours for non-essential services, such as criminal record checks and fingerprinting. And aside from the police services, you may also find that in-person interviews are obviously not best practice these days for your organization. In terms of ID verification for the criminal record checks, we have seen that Canada Post was deemed an essential service. So if you were verifying people's ID by directing them to the post office, that has continued, but some locations may have reduced hours of operation. And that's true even in British Columbia for myself. I was actually just asked to get a criminal record check to help volunteer at my son's preschool, and the police service is gradually reopening, but I have to phone to make an appointment. I can't assume that the broader office hours are carte blanche for me to go in and get that done. It's typically by appointment only. So there are some limitations to keep an eye on there. And so COVID-19 has actually shone a light on these processes a bit. So, thankfully, screening companies are largely 100% operational with employees working remotely, as you can see with Marina and Mark and myself. And our police partners are fully operational as well. So results are being returned as usual. I think we're a bit lucky in Canada to be operating in that scenario. Some other countries are not 100% operational due to COVID yet. But criminal record checks with any private background screening company in Canada are pretty much uninterrupted. The one thing I will comment on, though, where we've seen some changes is COVID-19 has shone a bit of a light on the RCMP's ID verification process or their policy. Typically, of course, that there has been the capability to do this online by asking some credit questions pertaining to one's credit file. We've seen that change, though, a bit. So what the RCMP have done is that they've acknowledged that obviously you don't want to be sending everyone out to a retail outlet like a post office or to meet with a hiring manager physically to verify ID. So they've temporarily relaxed the standard a little bit. So some of this ID verification can be facilitated digitally via Zoom. And they're also looking at newer technologies to verify ID. So the policy that's in place up until very recently was written about 10 or 15 years ago. So it's quite dated. And what we've seen is a bit of a movement towards adopting newer technologies to facilitate this. So whether you're working with us or another company or just sort of new to the market altogether, it's good to ask questions about what options are available to you as there are some new technologies coming in that can help make this a bit easier so you don't have to direct people out into public if you don't feel comfortable with that. Before I move on from COVID, and the impact on the industry, the last thing I'll probably touch on aside from criminal record checks is the verification services. Over the last few months, we have seen some delays as a lot of education institutions were shut down. It made verifying this information a little bit tougher. So that was one area that did see some impact. However, we have seen some improvements to that recently as a lot of the schools are beginning to reopen. There are more staff there that are able and willing to verify this information for us. That is a fluid situation, however. Again, drawing from personal experience here in British Columbia, they had just announced about a month ago that schools are reopening in full in the fall, but that didn't really sit well with the teachers' unions and a lot of parents because there wasn't a lot of structure or framework around it. And just yesterday, the province here in BC announced that school's not going to start in the first week of September. So everyone's basically taking it day by day. But in terms of background screening, it's pretty much back to normal from a verification standpoint as well, but there might be the odd country where things are still locked down or at reduced capacity.
Great. So it looks like our poll is actually working. Is my audio a little weird?
No, you're clear.
Okay. So before we actually move on to the current trends, there's a question in the polls. What does your background screening program look like right now? So if you don't mind filling out the poll right now, and we'll take a look at the results. And while you're doing that, I also wanted to encourage everyone to put your questions in the chat as we're going through the content. We should have a few minutes at the end to address them. All right, I think the results have slowed down. So it looks like about 63% have criminal record checks and references. There are about 25% with crim references global, so a whole slew of services. And only one vote for not knowing what a background screening program is. So that's good. So Iain, what do you think about that?
I always love this poll. It's always good to see what everyone else is doing. It sounds pretty consistent with what we see from a lot of professional organizations. And this slide's actually a good segue. The poll, I should say, is a good segue to our next slide. So what we see across the industry is not necessarily representative of what you do, but at least what many of you do with us. So we do see that the criminal record checks are far and away the most popular screening service that we have. But that's also because of the nature of the industries that we work with. So we do work with a cross section of manufacturing, retail, finance, you name it. But some of those industries like the gig economy, not-for-profits, licensing bodies, a lot of them pretty much just do criminal record checks and don't do references or checking various credentials. But this is a good sense of what we see day to day. And so if you don't mind going to the next slide, Marina, I can add a little bit of color to that and share some of the trends. Thanks. So yeah, as I mentioned, criminal record checks really are the most popular for the reasons I just mentioned. We do see that social media screening is really on the rise. I know it's been a hot button topic for probably about 10 years now. And thankfully, I think we've moved past the days where hiring managers would ask for your Facebook password to try to get in and have a peek at what you're up to. I mean, that just sounds terrible now, but that message needed to be shared quite a bit 10 years ago, as I'm sure Mark can attest. But the third-party screening companies are able to assist with social media screening and just looking at the footprint that your potential hires are putting out there in the world. So that is really picking up steam. What's on the decline is often credit checks. So about 10 or 15 years ago, these used to be done fairly pervasively on a lot of new hires. But I think a much more reasonable approach is to only do them when necessary. Mark will touch on that standard a bit more in the next few minutes, but we've seen them decline in volume quite a bit. They're largely just used for financial positions now, or people that have access to personal information. No longer are they being used for most new hires. And lastly, again, the traditional employment screening, we do typically see broader packages done for those where they're verifying education, previous employment, and references. But also, of course, our industry can help out with global screening as well. And so that international component is really picking up. And I wanted to take the next couple of minutes sharing a quick story with you about best practice in terms of global screening. Do you mind moving forward, Maria, to the next slide? Thanks. So, one of the trends that we've seen is it's obviously quite reasonable for an organization to want to establish a global background screening policy. But what we've seen is it's difficult to have a uniform standard across every country that you may have offices located in. So there was a tech company based in Vancouver that I was working with that wanted to establish this sort of global policy. But one of the challenges they ran into is they figured much like the majority of their operations being in Canada and the US, that they would want to perform criminal record checks on every new hire, because that's pretty much the standard in those regions. But they also had a team of developers in Ireland, and they ran into some roadblocks there, because the prevailing policy in Ireland is that a criminal record check should not be used to influence a hiring decision unless you're working in a very sensitive environment. Perhaps you're aiming to become a doctor, a nurse, a teacher. Those are really the only areas that they want to be weighing one's criminal past into an employment decision. So they had a bit of a conundrum. They couldn't apply this policy globally because they couldn't screen their staff in Ireland. So that was the first important thing to keep in mind, that you do want to have it tailored country by country. And perhaps one of the more salacious or noteworthy examples of that came up with another organization that we've been working with for quite some time. So it was a sporting body that was typically screening Canadian coaches. And in that case, their policy was typically to ask the coach to go to the local police or to come to us and obtain a background check and to share it with them. So this was the guidance they typically offered all of their candidates, regardless of where they were located within the world. And so this one organization had a coach from Texas. And they gave him that same guidance: please go and get a check from the local authorities. And this fellow had done that and then shared the check with them, and everything seemed to be fine. It was clear. But some people at that organization began Googling this coach and found some terrible news articles suggesting that this person had been arrested and convicted of a lot of sexual offenses. In fact, the offenses were that he was having sex with underage students that he was responsible for. Obviously, this gave him quite a scare. They reached out to us and asked, we asked this person to get a criminal record check. It says that he's clear and it's from the authorities. Why we can't make sense of this? Why would there be these articles that clearly look like it's him, but the check said otherwise? And it's an important lesson that we sort of walk them through, which is that the way that criminal record checks are done in the US is quite different than they're done in Canada. So if you direct someone to their local police in Canada, whether it's Ottawa or Toronto or Vancouver or Halifax, by and large, you'll receive the same type of criminal record check that contains the same information. It'll be a comprehensive nationwide search. In the US, however, they'll ask you to run a social security number trace first to find out where you've lived. And that's the way that most screening companies do it. But in this case, what this individual had done is he had moved to New Mexico, and he had just gone to authorities in New Mexico and obtained a check which had the New Mexican authorities name and logo on the letterhead. But there's a false sense of confidence there. That check was only saying that he didn't have a record in New Mexico. 5 years ago, he had that record that was a mile long in Texas. So that was a very eye-opening experience for that Sward organization. Thankfully, once they'd worked with us and we'd explained the nuances of screening between Canada and the US, they ran the appropriate searches and verified that all that horrible news they Googled and found was actually correct. So it's an important reminder that not all countries perform screening in the same way. We're quite lucky in Canada that there's a consolidated database that can gather most of this for you. But in the US, it's done very piecemeal, and it's certainly every country is quite a bit different. So wanted to share that with you and pass it back to you, Marina.
Thanks, Iain. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about legal considerations for screening.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining our session. Much appreciated. I'm going to do a quick overview of some of the legal considerations in Canada. And I think, the topic of the day for a lot of people is COVID-19 and how things have changed. This piece is really more an exercise in how things have stayed the same. There hasn't been a change in compliance requirements, and the law still applies in spite of the pandemic. But what we've seen is that a lot of organizations have had a change in their workflow, a change in their, in the workload, and have used this opportunity to review their policies and procedures and just take a fresh look. And it's always a good time to take a fresh look at your screening policy and make sure that it meets your needs, that it's compliant, and that you've thought about all the relevant compliance considerations rather than just doing what has always been done. So I'll do a quick overview of Canadian laws, but I think to what Iain was talking about just a moment ago, I want to caution everyone that Canadian rules about background screening do not apply elsewhere. They don't extend when you're screening for your own employees in other countries. So to the extent that you're just hiring in Canada, this guidance is good. But as soon as if you're responsible for a global screening policy and you're hiring people for your office in Ireland or for your office in the United States, then different rules will apply, and having a good background screening partner in place will help navigate that and help make sure that you have a sense of where to look for information about other countries. So to start, I think the most notable rule to be concerned with in doing background checks is privacy laws. In Canada, there is a federal privacy law, PIPEDA, in the private sector. There are also public sector privacy laws in every jurisdiction. And a number of provinces have their own private sector privacy laws. There's a few of them listed on the screen here. PIPEDA is federal. It doesn't necessarily cover employees. PIPEDA applies to employee data and applicant data in the federal sector, so businesses that are federally regulated, but provincially, employee data is generally regulated under provincial privacy laws if they exist. Alberta, BC, and Quebec have longstanding provincial privacy laws. Manitoba has one that is not yet in force. And other provinces don't necessarily in the private sector have privacy laws that protect employees. But all that said, having good privacy practices and following good privacy principles is a good idea everywhere because employees expect it. The principles of privacy laws, I'll just go through them quickly because I think it's important to understand the principles, but we don't have time to dig into all the details. But the bottom line is that it's important to give notice to individuals that you're going to be collecting their data, what data you'll collect, and get their consent for that collection. In employment, it's not always strictly necessary to get consent, but having that signature helps back you up if anyone complains that you collected their data after the fact. And also minimizing data, ensuring that you only collect what you need. And that's really relevant in background screening when you're deciding which types of background checks to request. Iain was talking about credit and criminal and references and the various different types of background checks. The goal when complying with privacy principles is to ensure that you're only collecting the data that you need to make a decision. And then, of course, individual rights, ensuring that that people have a right to ask questions about what data is being collected, understand what's going to be done with that data, where it's going, and have access to it after the fact. So in Canada, candidates almost universally, there may be some rare exceptions, but almost universally Canadian job applicants or people undergoing background checks have a right to see a copy of their background check report, with some exceptions. So beyond privacy laws, and you can actually stay on that slide if you don't mind, Marina, the previous one, Constitution, federal laws. Just want to touch on human rights laws. So this is also really important, and as HR professionals, I think we're all very aware of the need and the requirement not to discriminate illegally. These human rights laws across the country at the federal and provincial level, very important to understand them and make sure that you understand when you're collecting information that might be protected and that you're avoiding discrimination based on that information. So I've noted the Canadian Human Rights Act that applies again to federal employers. I've listed on this slide the protected categories. And then on the next slide, I've pulled out a couple of examples of provincial laws so in every province and territory has a human rights law, but everyone is a little bit different. So it's important to understand in the province or provinces where you operate, what types of information are protected. Is it possible you'll get those in the application or background screening process? And how will you ensure that you don't discriminate on that basis? And there's a number of ways to do that, and having a good screening policy is a good way to start. There are also some exceptions, though, and if you want to move to the next slide, Marina, there are circumstances where you can, where there is a bona fide occupational requirement where you must discriminate on some basis. There are also some exceptions for special interest organizations. If you serve a religious group or you serve the interest of a protected class, your organization may be able to discriminate positively on that basis. So it's important to know what the exceptions are if you do need to rely on them. And if you where you think there is an exception, you also have to consider reasonable accommodation. And that's, if you want to move to the next slide, the employer, anytime an employer thinks that they need to discriminate on the basis of a protected characteristic under a human rights law, the employer is held to the standard of having to accommodate that person to the point of undue hardship. So if it is an undue hardship for the employer to bring that person on board because of their protected characteristic, which could be their age, could be their disability, it could be a religion, could be various other things, the employer must take it to must go to a great length to accommodate that person. And only if it causes a safety issue or really massive costs or other things that would constitute an undue hardship can you then discriminate against that person. I'm conscious of the time, but very quickly want to touch on criminal records and human rights laws, because this is something that is frequently misunderstood around the country, and it's very important to understand as an employer, what your obligations are when collecting criminal history information. First of all, criminal record information is not protected under human rights laws in every jurisdiction in Canada. It's protected only in some. And most Canadian jurisdictions protect pardoned criminal history, and so employers have to have a really good reason if they're going to ask for information about a criminal record that's pardoned, but that information is really hard to get your hands on, so most employers are never going to see it. There are a few jurisdictions, most notably BC, Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, and the Yukon, where there is a prohibition, or there's rules in the human rights law limiting employers' ability to discriminate based on a criminal record. However, it is not an absolute blanket protection. Employers are absolutely allowed to ask for criminal history or criminal record checks, and the obligation, though, on the employer is to only make an adverse decision if the criminal record is related to the position. So on the screen right now, and I think everyone can take this away and keep this as a reference, because I think it's really important, is the test that was set out in a BC court case from many decades ago around what questions an employer needs to ask when determining whether a criminal record is relevant. And it really does need to be an individual assessment in those jurisdictions where there are protections in human rights laws. You do need to consider each employee on the merits and on the basis of the role they'll be filling. And then there's the next slide is really just a brief overview of what rights employees or candidates have if they believe their rights have not been respected. There are regulatory bodies that can assess these complaints. People can make civil claims against an employer if they feel that their human rights or their privacy rights have not been respected. So it can get costly and complicated to respond when someone feels that their rights have not been respected. So all the more reason to have a good policy in place to ensure that you're protecting people's privacy and their human rights. So just very briefly on the next slide, we can actually, right, I thought we had one more slide in there, but that's okay. Just to sort of sum up what I was getting at, having a documented background screening policy is really important. It should show what the purpose is of your program, how the process works, what types of checks are being run and why, and the process for evaluating the results. And that helps protect your organization. It makes sure that you do everything consistently, and it gives you some documentation in case someone does make a complaint to show that you have put together a compliant policy. And running that policy by legal counsel is, of course, key.
Great.
So,
I know we are almost at time, so maybe one more minute, Iain, for this, to be conscious of time for the session. And if you do have questions, again, just put them in the chat.
For sure, yeah. I think the three of us will hang around a little bit past the session, just in case you do have any questions, and certainly we can connect via the networking option later on as well. Just to put a bow on, if I can, on what Mark was saying earlier regarding that BC court test and how to apply this, I thought I'd very quickly provide a quick case study or scenario that I came across with a company last year. So we received a call from an organization that didn't have a background screening policy in place yet, but they had an incident of theft where one of their customers had complained that an employee that had attended their home had stolen some jewelry, and so the organization wished to investigate it. But part of their investigation was a bit misguided. They wanted to run a criminal record check on the individual to see if they had a criminal past. And to Mark's point, it is so important to have a background screening policy laid out ahead of time to ensure that you're performing the right searches for the right position, that you're not discriminating against an individual, so you're applying the same standard across everyone with that role, and that the screening makes sense for that role. So I walked them through that a bit and said, look, you can't really cherry pick one person and ask them to go get a check if you've got thousands of people in that role. And what is that check going to tell you? How are you going to act upon that information? If you find out that they have a conviction from 20 years ago, is that relevant? Does it matter what offense it is? If it's a drunk driving offense from 20 years ago, how does that help you with your investigation? Even if it's theft, how does that help you with your investigation? It doesn't mean that they committed this offense. I mean, yeah, by common sense, it may be more likely that they're prone to that, but it's not really helping you out. So when we walk them through all the scenarios of how, regardless of what the outcome of the search is, even if it's advisable privacy-wise, human rights-wise to do it, it's not giving you any actionable intelligence. It's far better that you maybe could have avoided the scenario by screening pre-hire. So it was a very helpful exercise or helpful lesson to walk through with that customer, and they've since established a proper background screening policy to ensure they don't fall in any of these pitfalls. Back to you, Marina.
Great. Thank you. Well, we are at time. I did put in the chat that, we have an extended version of this content available on our website. So if you're interested in getting more information, please visit our website under the webinars. You'll be able to get a lot more. Thank you so much for joining this session. We are going to be available throughout the event, so feel free to ping myself or Iain And we hope everyone enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the event.